Edward Avol. He's the professor of clinical preventive medicine in the environmental health division at USC Keck School of Medicine. His research is focused on understanding the short and long-term effects of air pollution on humans. This has to do with climate adaptation. He has a special interest in a much broader topic, global human health effects of climate change. He has taught an undergraduate course at USC on this subject and will speak on this topic today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I apologize for my voice. I'm just getting over a cold. I'd like to talk to you today about some health aspects of the issues of climate change. And what I'd like to do, sort of summarized here, I want to get you thinking about climate change and health, but in maybe a wider parameter and more of a number of issues than maybe you've been thinking about. I want you to talk about and get you to think about some of the changes that are underway and then some of the things we can do to mitigate or adapt to what is happening. I might start out by saying that in general you might think about this in context of four, I guess we might call them basic laws of ecology, coined by Barry Commoner, who was a researcher at St. Louis University at the start of the sort of the environmental movement in this country. And he pointed out some very simple ideas, which are listed here, that everything's connected to everything else, that everything must go somewhere, that evolutionarily speaking, nature knows best, and that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And if you think about those ideas, you'll see they permeate throughout this discussion of climate change and many other aspects. There are a number of issues we could talk about in terms of climate change. It's much more than just changing temperatures. And I want to touch on each of these topics today, get you thinking about these, and get you to understand that when you think about the health impacts, it also is much larger than just it's hotter or colder. And they all can affect your health. This is a slide from the CDC looking at some of the complex interactions between the temperature change, climate change, extreme temperatures, et cetera, and health effects. And I want to point out some of these for you, get you thinking about them. We'll come back to this as we sort of work through the whole talk this morning. The big gorilla in the room, I guess, that we always talk about is, in fact, extreme weather. We talk about, you know, it's either hot or it's cold, or there's too much rain or not enough of it, or it's snowing, et cetera. And so let's start with that. It is true, if you look at the last 160 some odd years of temperature, there's been a noticeable shift. It's not quite exactly monotonically increasing, it's not always going up, but if you look at years and years and years of data, you do see a definite trend in what is happening. You do see that if you look at the many years, the most recent years have been the warmest. And so in some ways, most people mistakenly think about climate change as global warming. And there's sort of different aspects that we want to think about. So I want to get you to think about climate change. Because not everywhere is it getting warmer. Some places are getting colder at times of the year, have more severe weather, more snow, for example, this picture from Buffalo. And there have been more extreme storms around the world. We want to talk about both in the United States as well as around the world when we think about these aspects of climate change and health. Oops. Because of the shifting jet streams, because of the shifting intrusion of very cold air that normally, historically, has stayed closer to the polar caps, we do occasionally now get these very cold intrusions into the United States and help to explain and understand why we have these minus 50-degree events in the Midwest, where we've rarely seen those sorts of events before. But here in California, here in the Southern California area, best predictions are it's going to get warmer more frequently. We understand that. We have models that describe that, depending on where you live, which cities you live on, where you are, how far away you are from the ocean, from the seashore. Will determine to some extent how many more days will be in excess of 95 degrees on average, looking forward. But depending on where you live, this is going to be appreciable. We may get, for example, here in the San Gabriel Valley, the predictions are that within the next 20 or 30 years, there are likely to be 75 days a year over 95 degrees. And by the end of the century, that will probably be 100 days a year, more than 95 degrees here in this area. And so things are going to be warmer here, and we need to think about what that means in terms of our health. I don't think I have to argue with you to get you to believe that when it gets very warm, there are health issues associated with that. So extreme weather certainly has a number of direct effects, if it's very cold or very warm or very wet in terms of flooding, etc. But there are also indirect effects that I think we have to appreciate and have to think about and understand and plan for. When it gets very cold, for example, these are some from some historic records, cold events tend to shut down schools, stop education, tend to disrupt commerce, tend to stop shipping, industry, operations. So it has much more of a ripple effect through the economy than one might think. I was actually in Atlanta a couple years ago when it snowed in Atlanta for a couple of days, caught the city completely by surprise and shut down the city for several days. And those sorts of events have also health implications as well. So there are a number of indirect as well as direct effects. The list is considerable, and I list some of them here. I won't go through all these today in the interest of time, but I think if you think about what can happen if it gets so cold or so warm that we have to change our normal way of living, our normal activities, you can see how that ripples through everything we do and has impacts through economy and society. We in California are maybe most familiar recently with drought. Depending on whether you live in Northern or Southern California, you may either be cheering that we're out of the drought or that we continue on with it. We've certainly had some rain this year, but it hasn't solved our problem. It's still a very dry place. Predictions are still that even although we have had a significant amount of rain, we are still in a drought in Southern California. We have not replenished the water tables, have not replenished the reservoirs, et cetera, sufficiently. Drought brings fire, or at least the opportunity for fires to occur. We've seen more fires in Southern California, more fires in many places. And the nature of those fires are changing. We used to have what we would consider a fire season. We have a longer period of time now, maybe perhaps a couple of months longer now than was the case before. The fires themselves, in terms of frequency, seem to be more frequent. We are seeing hundreds of fires a year. And that, of course, has some potential human toll, but also has some environmental tolls as well. The seasons are changing. It's not just our imagination. Spring is getting here a little earlier. Autumn is arriving a little later. And you may think, well, what does a couple of days mean? What's the big deal? Does it matter? So, the good news is my plants are going to bloom earlier in the spring. Maybe they'll last a little longer in the fall. The growing season might be extended a little bit. But it does affect the larger picture. And you think about why this matters, and part of the answers have to do with migratory patterns. Part of the answers have to do with when the birds arrive, when species move, when their food supplies arrive. And if there's a mismatch, a timing issue between when the food is available for when the population is present. And if they mismatch, that has implications for the health of those populations. Climate zones are shifting throughout the country. And as we look forward and predict based on the information when and where, we will see this sort of ripple occur as some places become slightly warmer, some places become slightly colder, wetter or drier. That will help to shift the seasons in terms of what we can grow and when we can grow, both in terms of natural plants as well as agriculture. We'll talk about food and agriculture in a minute. But if you have allergies, if you're allergic, this has implications for you. What we are seeing is a shift in the growing season, but that rolls over into a shift in when allergens are present, when pollens are present, and how that may affect the population. And so depending on where you live, we are seeing more days of pollen and potentially more days of human response to it. The shifts in agriculture, the shifts in season, imply that there are also shifts in agricultural growth. Crop yields, performance of where we are now is going to shift, and it is shifting. Red on this map means less. We're going to have to change our crops, change our growing cycles, change what we grow where, or at least adjust for it. And so we need to think about what the impacts are on the human population because we rely on the foodstuff that we create. A big issue here is water. Water is a necessary resource. There are places in the world that have very little of it, places in the world that are going to get less of it. And it's estimated that by 2030, almost half of the world's population are going to live in areas where there is a very limited amount of water. And that implies issues of human health. There are lots of models that predict where those are going to occur, some more, some less, some accurate, some inaccurate, but they all predict that there are going to be shifts. And the issues are how much, when, and where. But there's general agreement that there are shifts underway. Why do we make a big deal about water? I don't think I have to sell you on the notion that we need water to exist, water to survive. But just to think about it in the context of human health, there are 1 billion people in the world that don't have adequate access to water. There are a couple of million people every year that die of very basic diseases associated with contamination of water supplies, such as diarrhea-related diseases. There are perhaps more than 50 countries in the world still that are dealing with what we consider to be pretty basic diseases. Cholera, for example, having to do with sanitation. And this is something we know about. It's not a new disease. There are millions exposed to inappropriate levels of arsenic, of fluoride in their water. And again, this is an issue of access, an issue of human health. And there are a number of diseases in contaminated water. Parasitic diseases, bacterial diseases that we know of, we know how to take care of, but there are hundreds of millions of people suffering from these diseases. And again, the change, the shift in water and where water is, what water is available, has impacts on human health. I'm interested in air quality, and my research for 45 years has been in the area of short and long-term effects on air quality and those effects on humans. We know that the world is a small place. The world has shrunk in many ways. What we've come to appreciate is that there is such a thing, in fact, as intercontinental transport of pollutants. Intercontinental transport of the jet stream moves air around the world. Dust storms from Asia, contamination from fires overseas do relate to us, just as dust storms and contamination from the United States moves to Europe. It all circulates. And so we are connected in that way. And so thinking about activities on the global scale is important because it affects our health. Because what is done in Asia in terms of their air quality does affect or can affect the air quality here. Similarly, as what is done here can affect air quality downstream. It's been previously mentioned that carbon dioxide is on the rise. We've been tracking that for many years. We have a good understanding of that. It is, in fact, higher than certainly we've ever seen, and as Dr. Lewis mentioned, in the ice cap record, have maybe ever known it to be. And it is climbing. It is not only climbing and increasing to levels we've never seen, but even the rate of increase is increasing. And so, in a sense, the time frame of response is shortening. Things are changing so quickly that we need to get moving if we're going to do something about it. There are many other aspects in terms of gases in the ambient air that we are concerned about in terms of global health. Greenhouse gases include not just carbon dioxide, which we tend to focus a lot on, but also methane, which was mentioned previously. Over half of the methane emissions come from human activities, and the important thing about methane in the context of health and discussion and greenhouse gases, among others, is that methane has over 20 times the cumulative impact of carbon dioxide in terms of impact environmentally. And so, in that sense, a little bit goes a much longer way, but we're not talking about a little bit. There are lots to be done, lots of issues there in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, trapping, and retainment of heat. After carbon dioxide, methane is the second most important greenhouse gas, arguably. It is higher. It's responsible for a substantial portion of global warming. It does reside in the atmosphere for a number of years in order to do some detrimental damage. And again, these sort of issues affect our general health. I speak about it because we are part of the problem. What we do, the amount we use, is creating part of the issue. And so the solution, partially, is within our hands. We can do something about this. If we think about it in the air pollution sense, methane becomes important in a number of ways. It has to do with the photochemistry, the chemistry that goes on in the sunlight every day. And in the higher atmosphere, in the upper stratosphere, it gets involved in reactions that lead to destruction of ozone. That's a bad thing in the higher atmosphere. In the lower atmosphere where we breathe, it leads to ways that increase ozone production. And that's a bad thing because we breathe it. And so again, it's confusing because in the upper layers of the atmosphere, having ozone there is a good thing. But down where we breathe, down here, it's a bad thing. And yet, because of the way things are stacked right now, we are doing sort of the worst possible damage in both places. We're reducing the filter at the upper layers and increasing the pollution we breathe at the lower levels. I'll mention ultraviolet radiation and sunburns, which we sort of all acknowledge as not being something unknown or uncommon. But in terms of our health, it's a big issue. Depending on the health of the ozone layer and the amount of radiation that we get, we can be exposed to more, which will affect our skin, will affect our health. It may interest you to know that melanoma is on the rise. In California, other places, it's one of the most frequently occurred cancers. The melanoma risks here are among the highest in the world in California. Partially because there are a lot of us here, partially because we tend to have a very outdoor-oriented lifestyle, and partially because of the decisions we make. But in this sense, I would argue to you that melanoma is getting to get worse based on climate change, and it's something that we can do something about as well. It's a treatable disease if you get to treating it. So in terms of what you do, regularly checking your skin, having others check your skin for parts of your body that you cannot see, using sunscreen, using rash guards. Any kind of sunscreen that you will use is a useful sunscreen. You don't have to wait for the perfect one. It's one that you will use. But that protects your health, and that is a health impact of climate change. We can talk about deforestation or desertification around the world. And we tend to think of it as more around the world, but as I'll show you in a moment, it's not just in other places. But when you think about these things, we think about the denuding, the removal of forests, and the clearing of areas. These have a number of impacts. The activities themselves increase emissions. The loss of the plants that are there to collect and engage in photosynthesis has an impact. It disrupts water cycles, increases soil erosion, disrupts people that live there in terms of what they are or can do, and so in that sense affects our health. You may remember from your childhood, Dr. Seuss warned us about this. He said, someone must speak for the trees. And so in the sense of deforestation, I'll remind you that this is an issue, again, that we need to take a stand on, that we need to do something. We can replant, and there are planting activities for a number of reasons going on. We can make a difference. Education is recurringly an important aspect of this. What we do to educate others, let them know what the issues are, share the information, which is why organizations like this league is so important. We can encourage, think about, address other alternatives. We can think about how we are responsible shepherds for environmental issues, for forests, for wildlife, for parks, and do something there and support with our money, with our mouth, with our economic decisions to make things change. Desertification on the worldwide scale is also happening, and it's happening on virtually all the continents, including here in the Western United States. It's not just in other countries. It's not just in Africa where things are being sort of left and denuded and not replaced. These are pictures from Arizona, pictures from the Coachella Valley, 130 miles east of here. We are doing things to our surrounding climate, our surrounding environment. We are making choices in terms of how we use and preserve the land, and that is impacting the larger environmental picture and ultimately our health. The impacts of desertification on our health are listed here. The lack of a growing area implies loss of food and potential water shortages, dependence on other programs to support those populations that are there that cannot have access to this, the shifting of populations worldwide to get some of these resources. And although you don't think about it as necessarily a climate change outcome, this leads to civil unrest, societal unrest, and potentially to armed conflicts. And so we can draw a connection for you that you should be aware of, that armed conflicts wars have been fought over access to water, access to food, access to agricultural opportunities. And so that is something that sort of is an impact on the large human scale. What can we do about it? We can provide humanitarian aid. We can think about that in context of food and water. We can provide water supplies. We can think about improving our water management system. And we're trying to do that. We can think about sustainable farming. And that may not be directly relevant here in Pasadena, but certainly is relevant in California, where we actually do feed the world with our with our agricultural output. Part of the answer may be in drought-resistant seeds, and that gets into the issue of genetic modification of seeds and their use. Controversial topic, raises lots of issues for people, but it is one way that we can think about extending and expanding and sort of countering the changes in the climate. Which gets us to food. There are lots of issues we can talk about in the context of food, and I don't think I need to argue with you that food is an important health outcome and has important links to our health outcome. We can think about in terms of hunger, in terms of availability of that food, the cost of getting it, how much we waste, the sustainability and security that we have to know that it's there, where our next meal is coming from, where our meal are coming from for our populations next month, etc. All these are aspects of food security, of food sustainability, or choices we make that are wrapped up in where we can grow our food, when we can grow it, how much we can grow, how we use it. And part of the issue is that there's a real question, I think, between looking at some of the world's leading crops, be it corn, rice, wheat, soybeans, and the solid lines sort of being the rate of increase in terms of agricultural growth, but the dotted lines being where the populations are going, and the widening gap between those two, and how we close that gap, how we deal with those issues. Which again comes back to stresses on the society, to increasing confrontation over limited resources, and potentially to armed conflicts. And so again, in terms of health outcomes, this is a very real health outcome of significant import on a societal level. Dr. Lewis mentioned the other CO2 problem, not thinking about the air, but thinking about the water. And we do have an appreciable problem in terms of thinking about all that CO2, because it doesn't just stay in the atmosphere. In fact, it does interact with the ocean. And as is pointed out, ocean acidity in general, is a very delicate thing. Small changes in pH make big changes in human health. And your blood pH is in the 7.3 to 7.4 level, and so a tenth of a unit can put you into a coma or to a healthy status. And so these changes that we're seeing, changes that are happening over time, which now seem to be very short time periods, are concerning, because the ocean behaves in similar ways. And that's what's causing stress and death in coral reefs and the surrounding symbiotic relationships between other plant and animal species in the ocean. Here in Los Angeles, along the coast, maybe we're more sensitive to the vulnerability of sea level rise. We're probably not too worried here in Pasadena. We're a few hundred feet above sea level, but it has a problem, it has an issue. It will affect the health of our community, the vitality of our community, and it is happening. And this map shows sort of where around the coasts of the United States we ought to be and are taking note and ought to be concerned. Sea level rise is the culmination of a number of events: the warming of the waters, exact some expansion, some thermal expansion, but also melting of ice, melting of glaciers, tectonic activity that move things around. All these things do affect sea level rise, and predictions are, in the course of the next 50 years or so, sea level will rise appreciably here. We're talking not about small amounts. We're talking about, name your metric. We're talking about inches. We're talking about feet. We're talking about even a yard or two in terms, or a meter or two in terms of increased water, sea level rise. It's been increasing. We've been able to document it. It continues to increase. And again, as with the case of carbon dioxide increases, the rate of sea level rise is increasing. So things are happening faster on a shorter time scale. And that's becoming an issue of concern for us because there are vulnerable populations, there are vulnerable activities along the ocean coast. We are seeing it played out in terms of accelerated beach erosions, higher incidence of cliff failures, navigational issues, safety compromises along the beachfront, even saltwater intrusion into water tables and aquifers. And as the saltwater gets in and contaminates the fresh water, then we have a problem that spills over into another domain, that of water. But just to sort of drive home the point, these are maps drawn from the US Sea Grant program, which looks at some of these issues in terms of sea level rise. So this is a picture of Alamitos Bay here down by Long Beach, and all the areas in color are areas that will be affected, essentially covered in water, underwater, on these increases of 50 or 100 centimeters of water in the course of the next 50 to 100 years. And so where we are, it's going to change here in our backyard. If you're not familiar with Alamitos Bay, we can look at Marina del Rey. All these areas in color are going to be underwater. And so how we think about that and what we do to plan for that, which may mean changing where we build, changing how we build, changing where we live or choose to live. And if you think about the infrastructure along the coastline, there are serious questions ahead. I ask you this in a question to get you to think about. Maybe something you've never appreciated in this way. But it turns out mosquitoes are actually one of the deadliest animals in the world. They are responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths a year by transmission of disease, of vector-borne disease. And we don't think about them as being that powerful, but in fact, because of the number, kinds, and virulence of some of those diseases, it is an issue. And the location, penetration, and coverage of a number of diseases, vector-borne by mosquitoes and ticks, is changing. And it's changing here. It's not just something we read about for other places in other countries, it's changing here. So I want to talk a little bit about vector-borne diseases. I don't think I'll surprise you by telling you you can get bit by a mosquito. And the mosquito shares with you, and in addition to taking some of your blood, shares with you some of what that mosquito is carrying, often in the way of bacteria or viruses. And so what conditions promote disease? Well, when it's warmer. And when it's warmer, mosquito populations thrive. They like it to be warm. When it's poorly sanitized, if there are places that they can breed. If it's wetter, if there are areas of moisture, those populations can multiply quickly. If there are a lot of people around, there's a ready source of food for them, which is why mosquitoes and urban living go so well together. And if people have compromised immune systems, if you are either ill or have some compromised immune system so that the disease that we are thinking about the end cycle, the receiving end of what this leads to, it's going to become a problem for our health. There are a number of diseases that are moving around the world. I'd like to just talk about a couple of them because they may be ones that you may not have heard about or be familiar with. West Nile virus is now pretty commonplace in this country. This map from the CDC shows where cases have been reported, basically throughout the country. Most of us have hardly ever heard of West Nile virus. That was something that, isn't that something in other continents far away? But no, it's not. It's here. It first appeared here about 15 or 20 years ago. It's spread by mosquitoes. Usually symptoms are mild. For most people, you may not even be aware you have West Nile virus because many of the symptoms are much like the flu. You get a fever, you feel lethargic, cough, you may be sick for a few days, and then it clears. But if you are at risk, if you have immune system deficiencies, it may be more of a problem. We don't have specific treatments or specific vaccines. So what we need to do is go back to the source, prevent, stop the mosquito, and we prevent proliferation, spread of the disease. If we look at chikungunya, most people have never even heard of chikungunya virus. But this, in fact, now is appearing in the United States. And this map from the CDC, all the light or dark colored areas show where there have been reported cases in the country. So essentially, they've been reported everywhere in the country. And in Texas, not only are these cases being reported from people who have traveled other places and brought the disease home, but they're actually locally acquired cases. And so you can expect that once that disease has sort of established itself in southern United States, it will move as the environment allows it to into other states as well. And so again, I remind you, the world is a small place. We can be almost anywhere in a couple of hours. And as we do that, we sometimes bring things back we didn't expect to bring back with us. Zika has become an issue. And for many of us, who ever heard of Zika? A trivia question for you is, what is Zika? Where does it come from? What was it named? Why was it named? Zika is a forest in Uganda. It was first found there in East Africa. But we became aware of it, maybe most recently, most people, with all of the concern about the Olympic Games in Brazil and the exposure of the world's athletes and spectators coming to Brazil and maybe bringing it back everywhere else. Well, as of earlier this month, CDC says here is where we've confirmed cases across the country. And so essentially, it's moving through the United States now, establishing itself in the United States. And not only is it establishing itself in the United States, it's actually endemic in some U.S. territories now, in Puerto Rico and other places, in Hawaii, in American Samoa. This is becoming increasingly a regular problem. Again, the symptoms itself are similar to other comparable sorts of diseases that you see by and large. It has symptoms that mirror the flu, chikungunya, West Nile virus. You may get most people just get a light fever, lethargy, feel sick for a few days, and it clears. But with Zika, as you may have heard in the newspapers, online, etc., there are other more serious issues, too, which is microcephaly, which is for pregnant mothers who are infected, the offspring having issues in terms of neurological development that is a lifelong problem. And then a certain syndrome that has to do with your own immune system turning on your nervous system. And so you have an internal war going on, as it were, through Guillain-Barré syndrome. Again, these are not common. These are relatively rare events, but they're becoming more common as the disease gets established. So the question for you all is, are you a mosquito breeder? What are you doing at home to minimize the spread of disease? And I think all of us, whether it's wet or dry, whether we think we live in a drought or not, All of us have places that capture water, that retain water. A mosquito only needs a few millimeters of water to be able to lay her eggs. That will support the population and propagation. And so think about what your backyard looks like. Think about what your house looks like. Think about where there are opportunities for water to sit for days or weeks at a time. That's where mosquitoes breed. And so doing something in your backyard, cleaning out the clogged rain gutters, making sure that you don't have buckets sitting in the backyard, that you don't have leaky faucets to just provide sort of a wet, consistent pool for mosquitoes to breed, is one way you can actively make a difference, make a change, and deny the opportunity for mosquitoes to breed. Lyme disease in other parts of the country, you may have heard of, but it's not just in other parts of the country. It has been reported here in California as well. This is a tick-borne disease, and it's a small, it's a small tick. You may not even notice it. But it's developed partially because of human activity, partially because of where we've chosen to live, where we've chosen to develop neighborhoods, the interface between forested areas and housing developments, and the close proximity that we've put people and forests together. And so we have a shifting and exploding, really, number of cases being reported in this country. As you can see from this map from the CDC, most of it is in the Northeast and the North Midwest, but there are cases reported in other parts of the country. And it is a reportable disease. It's probably underreported at least tenfold, but there are still 30,000 cases of Lyme disease reported in this country every year now. And keep in mind, that's probably underreported. There are probably 300,000 cases of those. What do we do when we get sick? We go to the doctor and say, I need some medicine. Give me something for this. I'm not leaving your office until I get some medication. And so you leave with an antibiotic. Taking an antibiotic for a viral agent for your cold is not going to do any good. Not only is it not going to do any good in terms of dealing with your illness, it potentially exacerbates the problem because it helps to fuel the development of resistant bacteria, resistance to the medication that you're taking. And we are running out of effective antibiotics. And so I would suggest to you that in terms of climate change that lead to disease, that lead to doctor's visits, that lead to an adamant request that I want medication, and I'm going to take this medication, and maybe I don't even use all my medication. Maybe I'll save some of it for next time I get sick. So I won't take the full 10 days. I'll just use it till I start to feel better, and then I'll keep some for next time. Well, all that plays exactly into the proliferation and development of antibiotic resistance. So if you're going to get medicine, take your medicine, all of it. But you don't need an antibiotic for the flu. You don't need an antibiotic for a cold. You need the proper vaccine, you need the proper medication, but don't demand it when it's not necessary. So what can we do to adapt to all this? There are a number of things to do. If we talk about heat, being here in Southern California, we can think about improving our design. We can think about improved insulation, about optimizing the use of materials, even going to what are known as cool roofs. You know, all of our roofs are painted black. The shingles are black. They absorb heat. It makes it very warm. We can think about trees. We can think about cooling centers. Here in the urban areas, we tend to have what are known as urban heat islands. The fact that everything together, the blacktop for the asphalt, the buildings with black tops, black roofs, all help to absorb heat, and it's typically several degrees warmer in a city than it is in the surrounding area. Several degrees warmer in urban canyons, around streets, well-developed streets with buildings, than other places. And so we can do something for that. There's a number of studies underway. One of my colleagues, George Van Weiss, in engineering at USC, has got a large study going on in Los Angeles to try and understand and map and predict where we can make changes in the city to get the best improvement in terms of adjusting and minimizing this heat island. And so we're looking at dark surfaces. We're looking at, you know, those big urban canyons where there are no or minimal trees and what we can do to change that. And we can change it by going to whiter roofs. That's not going to solve our problem. We can change it by going to green roofs, although that won't solve our problems. We can change it by planting more trees. That may help in some ways, because it turns out, based on George's work, it looks like trees are actually pretty efficient as cooling the surrounding area. And so although trees may not be a complete solution, the planting of trees may actually cool more efficiently the surrounding area than thinking about even painting your roof white or going to white shingles. We can think about other things. We can think about better use, more efficient management of water. We can think about how we respond to floods and so forth. How we respond, being educated, making wiser choices, I think are all important to this. Before closing, I just want to get you to think about the notion that it's not only how the climate affects us, it's how we affect the surrounding diverse populations around us, plants, animals, birds, etc. And so we are affecting the surrounding diversity of the environment, as well as climate change affecting us. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's interaction, it's a two-way street. And what if we're wrong? What if we do all these improvements? What if we make this a better place to live and we got some of this wrong? We just end up with a more efficient lifestyle. So I'd argue to you that maybe it's not all bad to just move forward pretty aggressively. I know I went through a lot of material in a short period of time. I want to give you some closing thoughts to remember. First, there are a number of aspects, I would argue, beyond just it's hot or cold. So don't exclude the fact that in all these areas, vector-borne diseases, sea level rise, deforestation, ultraviolet radiation, air pollution, crop yields, allergens, all these things are interrelated. So there's lots going on, lots of changes underway, but there are also lots of things we can do. Lots of ways we can adapt, lots of things we can do to mitigate, lots of changes we can make in our own lifestyles and lifestyles of our society, of our communities that will make a difference. With all that said, you're probably full by now, and so I will say class is almost dismissed. And thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Right, so the question is, what can we do about fracking? Well, fracking requires huge volumes of water to operate, and the water is pumped at high pressure into the ground to crack and provide access to sources of primarily natural gas, but other fossil fuels that we might be interested in completing. This is a business decision, in essence. This is a way in which the fossil fuel industry has decided to more efficiently extract limited resources to make ourselves more energy independent. But it does require tremendous volumes of water, also requires the injection of certain solvents and chemicals in that water, which contaminates that water. And I think, the issue, in terms of what we can do, I think the process itself requires huge volumes of water. We're not going to change that dramatically. I think what we have to do is change the perspective on where we use it and what we do. Fracking goes on here in California, fracking goes on here in Los Angeles. And so that's a political decision, I think, as much as anything else. I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you. Yeah, I don't disagree with you, but I mean, the issue of fracking is a whole nother forum that we might, talk about.
I'm just concerned about the chemicals and, the intimate mingling with our drinking water.
Well, I appreciate your comments, and again, I think it's a business decision and a political decision in terms of what we use, what fuels we use, and how we go after them.
Good presentation, though depressing. But my question is, do you think we should eliminate mosquitoes, but do something similar?
Well, one of the ways that we use the control program is actually to release sterilized mosquitoes, and that way, in terms of breeding, there won't be another generation.
Should we take it up a notch?
I don't know the complete life quality contributions of mosquitoes, so there may be some good that they do. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but but I think they propagate so quickly and such concentration, and because again, the opportunity for diseases quickly to move through populations and through locations because of the fact that travel has become such a regular part of international life raises issues about how we have to control mosquito breeding in certain areas.
I think that's it. Thank you very much, Ed. Just a few brief thank yous. First of all, thank you to the audience for coming today. We hope that we see a lot of you next year. My feeling is, and I think a lot of us think, that coming every year is not at all a bad thing. There's always something new. The climate change situation is changing, and there's a lot to learn.